Hello, everyone. I'm Christy,
I'm Stephanie.
and welcome to the Parent Teacher Conference. We are so glad you're here. We have started this podcast to help parents navigate the complexities of school by drawing on our own experiences as educators, as mothers, and as lifelong learners. Before we dive into today's topic, we want to establish our intentions by telling you a little bit about who we are, why we're here, and what we hope to bring to the podcast. Stephanie, can you start us off by telling us a little bit about you and why you're here?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I'm so excited to be recording our first episode with you. I wanted to start off by just maybe sharing a little bit about why I got into education, because I think it helps to frame why I'm so excited to be doing this podcast today. I got into education because, it's simple. I care deeply about children, and I care about my role in that space to create an environment where kids can, discover who they can create, and ultimately use education to bring themselves closer to who they are. And I think somewhere along the way, when I got into education, this idea became a little bit fuzzy. Sometimes when we're in schools or institutions, there are rules, there are policies, there's procedures, conventions that they might serve an important point in the time that they arise. But if we don't continually reevaluate those rules or conventions and think about it from the perspective of who is in front of us, it can sometimes take us away from what I think schooling is supposed to be about. Now, I know rules and policy and conventions are important. Like, I would never do away with taking attendance because it's for safety. That's such an important rule that we want to know who's in the building with us. But for example, how we discipline a child might change according to their individual circumstances and their needs. And so I think parenthood reminded me specifically about why I got into education in the first place. Because it reminded me about seeing the individual for who they are. And again, love of a child is so powerful. It can snap you out of perhaps whatever autopilot program you might be on sometimes. So I think parenthood helped me to realize that those naive ideas I had about what education ought to be before I entered the system are actually what is most important to me as a parent and a teacher. And as they resurfaced, this bubbling feeling came up that I wanted to talk about this topic more and explore this topic through the lens of various different educational issues. Just to be more specific, I'm a mom of 1 to a 3-year-old, but I'm also currently pregnant with my second. And it's funny that during a time of pregnancy, you are in this beautiful awareness of care. Your body is literally caring constantly. And you're also in this protective place as well to allow growth and flourishing. And I feel like it's a special and unique spot to be talking about some of these topics because of that feeling, or because of the sensitivity that I have to that, those I guess, important aspects of what education I think should be about. So it is a really unique place, and I really honor and cherish that I get to have these conversations from that perspective. Also, exploring critical topics in education have always been a passion of mine, informally, but also formally through my education, through my research in my graduate studies. I looked at social media in my master's and the influence it has on our self-conceptions. And I've also, in my doctorate work, looked at the different narratives around privilege and how that could either help people to flourish or can detract from educational spaces. And so I hope this podcast is a place to continue to refocus on the things that I think really matter in education through a loving lens of a parent and the experience of an educator. And I think both are needed to build bridges. I think critical conversations need to be had. And I think that can ultimately spark change in how we show up for our learners and our children. Because ultimately, a parent-teacher conference shouldn't be something that happens once or twice a year. It should be an ongoing dialogue. So that is why I got into the podcast. Christy, can you tell me why you're here today?
Thanks for that. I think really honest, genuine, and vulnerable reflection, Steph. Certainly, I think our friendship and professional journey has intersected through our shared virtues and values around education, but also through our journey in motherhood as well. So I, like you, see the priorities of parenthood and teaching as big drivers that have brought me here. So for those who might not know me specifically or my background, I am a high school guidance counselor. I'm a mother of two beautiful boys, a 5-year-old and a 1-year-old. And over the course of my teaching career, I've taken a special interest in the issues affecting kids at school. That concern has pushed me to keep learning, growing, and to ask big picture questions. Somewhere in the middle of navigating motherhood for the very first time, I completed my master's in educational leadership and policy. And I'm someone who's always believed that education is about more than what's written in the curriculum. I also empathize with the fact that the school climate is often changing faster than parents can keep pace with, and that sometimes leaves parents feeling confused, overwhelmed, or just generally out of the loop, myself included at times. And so my hope is that with the podcast, we can build a bridge between families and the education system to create a space to have honest, open, critical conversations about the space where our children spend most of their waking hours.
Thanks for sharing. That was beautiful. So what better way then to dive into this journey than focus on one of the most pressing topics today, which is AI. So Christy, why don't you tell us about what AI is and give us maybe a general overview of how it's used in schools?
So I think a great starting point is to just distinguish for parents what kind of artificial intelligence we're going to be talking about and how it's being used in schools, as well as how kids are using it. Artificial intelligence, in its general sense, allows computers to learn from data and to make decisions or predictions in the same ways that humans do, but on a much faster and larger scale. Generative AI creates new content, producing things like text, images, music, code, or even video. And instead of just analyzing the data, it learns patterns and then produces something new or original. Probably the kind that is most concerning to us as educators, as parents, and one that we certainly will spend some time on in the latter half of this podcast is what's known as empathetic or companion AI. So this is designed to act like a friendly presence. It's something that you can talk to that keeps you company and offers emotional support. The empathetic AI is really using data around human emotions and inputs to try to respond in the way that a person would. So it is trying to mirror that human piece. As far as how it's being used in schools, Pew Research Center shared a report at the beginning of 2025, which was based on a survey of 13 and 17-year-olds, which indicated that the volumes of teens using ChatGPT for homework had doubled within a year. And within that same data, they did discern three sort of key areas that students are using it for. So firstly, to brainstorm ideas, in some instances to actually write essays or written assignments for them, and also to solve math problems. So those were the three variables that they looked at. And over the fall of last year, the Canadian Advisory Group, KPMG, released a report that stated that over 2/3 of students using generative AI had reported that they didn't think that they were actually learning as much in reflecting on their experience using it. Within that same report, also slightly concerning, they identified that 70% of those students said that they were turning to generative AI tools for help rather than asking their instructors or their teacher in the classroom space. A new study coming out of the Center for Digital Thriving, which is a research and innovation center at Harvard Grad School of Education, found that the most commonly reported use for AI was getting information at 53% and brainstorming at 51%. So pretty consistent with what KPMG was finding. But many noted that generative AI can help teens get answers to questions that they are often too afraid to ask adults. And so AI, in its positive framings, can be used to help them brainstorm, to get information, and to maybe build confidence around new subject matter. The intersection that sort of raises some red flags for me as an educator is seeing the increasingly documented movement towards technology or AI, as opposed to using the teacher or the expert in the classroom space.
Thank you for sharing that. I just wanted to go back to those three areas of concern that you highlighted in terms of use. So for homework, for brainstorming, and then also for executing tasks like assignments, projects, essay writing, and also math problems. Do you see any concerns with using AI at those stages of the game? So to generate information or generate ideas. Do you see any concerns or have any questions about what that might do to how we understand ourselves as a learner?
I think it's probably important to start with a bit of an acknowledgement or understanding for why we're in this place. Certainly over the last decade, there's been a big push to integrate more and more technology within the classroom space. And we've seen many schools move towards the idea of a one-to-one device model, starting firstly with iPads, then moving on to more hybrid devices, tablets with keyboards. And now really the idea is that kids should have technology in the classroom to learn. So we've been signaling to kids for a long time that this is the format for learning and this is the stage that we've set for you to learn. Now we've added in technology that can think for them and streamline some of the information seeking processes that we've already valued and validated in the learning space. So naturally, of course, when kids are used to defaulting to a device, it makes sense they would gravitate towards a chat GPT like model to ask questions and to find information. The reason that it's so concerning is the movement away from what education has traditionally been. How many of our kids are actually relational learners, meaning that they learn best based on the relationship to the teacher or facilitator in the room? If I think back to conversations I've had with educators over the years and my own experience about why you got into teaching, most of us can point to a teacher or teachers who really shaped our learning journey, right? And really made an impression upon us. If I think about my fifth grade teacher, Miss Mula, who had a lot to do with inspiring me to go into education in the first place, in our unit on human biology and the digestive system, she stood on her head upside down to eat a cracker. And that was to demonstrate the role that gravity plays in digesting our food. But it was a silly little moment that really spotlighted for me her care and her creativity in delivering content, right? So that was a relational learning moment for me that ultimately shaped my decision to become a teacher in a lot of ways. So if the relational piece of how kids learn and the value or trust that they place in the facilitator in the room is now being migrated to tech, it raises questions and concerns for me on how they are going to learn effectively. What is the risk reward for that blind trust in technology to answer their important questions while they're learning?
You have shared so many important ideas here. First, I love the way that you made that connection to what's already existing. And you've pointed out that there is already a strong reliance on technology in the classroom. And we've kind of set kids up to turn towards the device societally, as well as reinforce within classroom dynamics. And I think that's so important because it allows us to be empathetic when we're thinking about how kids are using it rather than going to, judgmental assumptions about, well, these kids are lazy. You're taking it a step back and saying, no, wait a minute. Let's look at the environment that they're in already. And I think that's such a refreshing way to see it, that we've kind of, as societally, have created this educational landscape and context. It's not just on the individual. And then what is even more beautiful about what you shared is then you made that bridge to, okay, this is a natural progression now. If this is something that's available on my laptop, on my phone, on the internet, and I already have this inherent trust with technology, why would I then not use it? And I think that is such an important point and gives us a little bit of compassion for the student as they're navigating this thing. But the second piece that I found to be really beautiful in terms of how you framed it is what is being taken away from the learning experience, and your story with your teacher about demonstrating the effects of gravity through human interaction and being creative and being herself was really special, because I think it highlights the essence of what education is all about. It's you as you are coming into contact with somebody else as they are and growing and learning from one another. That relational piece is essential. I believe an essential ingredient for human flourishing. And I think if we even just think back to 5 years ago and how COVID unfolded. And we saw how technology, was literally stacking up barriers in between us and social distance and isolation. It was it was hard, very hard at the time, but in terms of a thought experiment and understanding where technology can go, are we creating social distance through AI essentially then? Is this now the next way that the ethos of COVID is translating into our school environments, that we are creating social distancing, even though it is not a physical barrier? We might be sitting right beside one another, but we might as well be 3 meters apart, because I think then the effects of that distance will continue to have an effect on a learner. We can't anticipate everything, like we couldn't anticipate everything with COVID, but I think there is a general sense that we can feel that distance and we're working to repair it. And I think if it continues to get in the way of relational elements and we're not discerning of when and how is the best place to use it, then I think that divide will continue to increase.
I think those are great points, Steph. The other thing that really has me sort of stuck in evaluating the place and space that AI should or does occupy in a classroom or within a school has me reflecting on the messaging we send to students around what's valued and what's relevant in their educational experience. So from a parent-child perspective, what is the point and the purpose of school is a question that comes up for me a lot. On the tail end of things, right? I think the expectation is preparation for the real world, the solidification of skills that will transfer to post-secondary learning and job eligibility thereafter. And that is a very difficult thing to keep pace with given the rapid changes in technology. But what we essentially signal, I think, through our system as it currently stands to students is that grades are the currency that matters most, right, along your educational journey. They are the thing that you need to achieve. They are the thing that you're measured for in terms of your capabilities, your learnings, your school system value. And you need to get good ones in order to have a future, in order to have opportunities to get into post-secondary schooling, in order to get a job thereafter, in order to distinguish yourself from your peers. So that competitive currency around marks tells them that that is the thing that matters most. And those marks are earned or accounted for most often historically through the production of a product, right? An end piece, an assignment that's measured. So what we don't often do, or has been challenging to do in the current system, is to value process over product. And so I think that's something that students internalize, that parents internalize. And so why wouldn't I then lean into this innovative tool that is a hub of information that can get me a better result on my product? I think that's the default mode of thinking for students, because increasingly it's so competitive to get into a good school. Again, because of the emphasis that's placed on marks as a barrier for entry even, it's difficult to walk that back and say, well, this goes against academic integrity. This invalidates your critical thought. Don't use it. I think we, as a system of educators, schooling at large, really needs to think about the messaging that we give to students around AI. And it can't simply be don't use it. There needs to be tools and steps taken to teach them how to use it responsibly and to understand the value of the critical thinking piece and their own voice in order for that to be the thing that they prioritize and put time into, rather than just outsourcing their learning to a machine.
Again, the wisdom in what you just said, I think was so important for how we think about AI and developing tools, because again, you're starting at what is already in place and what exists. You're recognizing a challenge that is there with whether AI is prevalent or not. And that's the performance-based idea of school. And if we're focusing on product and performance, like you said, and there is that pressure because it becomes a currency for students to feel like they are valued, that they can be successful, then as you mentioned, why would they not turn to AI as a important piece in their learning journey? I'm using that word loosely, but why would they not rely on it if it's all about end result and not the process? That being said, though, I think it's so important for us to think about that topic, because when we are focused on product and performance, I think it also takes us away from, being our authentic self. And Okay, that word might sound wishy-washy, but I think authentic self is just the ability from moment to moment to act from a place of peace, comfort, and trust in what our thoughts are, what our feelings are, and to be able to use that to operate in different educational experiences. However, if I'm constantly worried about product performance, then I'm no longer seeing myself from the eyes of myself or how I want to be seen. I'm constantly filtering my actions through the lens of how I want someone else to see me. And so with AI, again, as you acknowledged, this problem already exists, but what AI can do then is now heighten that based on the frequency and reliance. So we might have done that naturally in interactions with school because of this high stress and intensity. But now if, as you mentioned, kids are using it to brainstorm ideas, which is supposed to be the rough work, the part where the process is there, where you're supposed to have a word dump of ideas and some that work and some that don't work. Or when you're writing a paper, you're supposed to go through that editing process and bring yourself to the topic and do different iterations of it. But if I'm getting it right on the first go, where is that piece? And so I really do wonder what that does to the development of ourself. I would never want my son to go about the world thinking that he is anything less than imperfectly perfect, because that's who he is. And I would want him to try things based on how he's feeling or what he's thinking, and not be afraid to fail, not be afraid to show his true colors, not be afraid to think. I would hate if he had to wear a lens on him that was constantly thinking about how do I be perfect, or how do I perform this in the best way. And I think AI, if kids are constantly turning to that at all steps of the educational process, then it can also start to not only academically but socially, emotionally change how people show up in their day-to-day lives.
I want to echo what you just said, Steph. I think it's so important, and put a plug in for authenticity, right? I think if we're talking about the erosion of relational learning, of critical thought and conversation, and how that contributes to forming a sense of myself, my views, how I relate to the world, for sure, that's the kind of thing that I think in a system that values currency and product and grades, it's easy to put that in the wishy-washy category and say, well, why does that really matter as a part of my child's educational journey or story, right? I've sent them to school to prepare them for their future, to learn math, to learn how to write, and to be better prepared for post-secondary life. What I would say is that as a guidance counselor, I've seen this. Universities understand that in the race first benchmarks and measures that really place a lot of emphasis on numbers to evaluate a child, they need more. They need more information about who that person is. And so through essays, through video interview platforms, through learning assessments like the Casper situational judgment test, we're seeing increasing metrics that are being used to discern who a person is as a means of granting admission to university, because a mark does not tell enough of that story. That is not a great means to rectify the current system, but it's a step, right? It's not the save all solution, but I think I want to highlight for parents and for students is that there is value in who you are, how you see yourself, and how you approach learning and your educational journey. And that's sort of the gray area that universities are indicating, is that we want to know more about you as a person. If I'm outsourcing all of my learning to a machine and not becoming in touch with my voice, how I reason, how I problem solve, how I show up, those skills are not going to be fully intact by the time that I'm having to look to make that post-secondary transition. So it's not only the responsibility of our curriculum to facilitate that, but it's the responsibility of parents and all of those relational touch points. And again, if students aren't having that contact with people in their classroom, with their teachers, it's going to be harder to mature and develop those skills if they're interacting exclusively with the screen.
I think that is a great point. And how you see yourself is a big deal, right? How you understand yourself. And I know you're tracing us through this high school journey, thinking about post-secondary, but even if you're thinking about post-secondary and into the workforce, just anecdotally to share, I was sitting in a coffee shop with some university students, and we got to talking about the use of AI. And I asked them, how is it being used? And they talked about how they use it to put in math equations to generate answers. And then they also use it for assignments. And then they also explain that they're using it for sometimes even exam or test taking. And so all those things that we talked about that are happening perhaps in high school are starting to happen now at the university level as kids migrate. But then I asked them, I said, okay, so now if you're in the position of you're in work, you're talking with your employer and they ask you something and you're in a meeting, how would you feel to answer a question on the spot? And they said, oh, yeah. By then we'll learn. But I challenged and I said, okay, but how will confidence, for example, or your image of yourself all of a sudden just emerge in the moment if you've had years of training where you never got to try and fail or think for yourself first, or if you're doing it just for homework and you're not explaining and talking? So I think a lot about how we show up then as adults, comes from these formative years. And I think that we need to start thinking about how our everyday habits, how our everyday interactions in the classroom are forming ideas of who we are and our self-image. If that then goes to include AI as an extension of ourself, then certainly we will always feel inadequate when we don't have it. And I'm not saying that there can't be a healthy way to use it. I just think the whole point of this is to think about these little kernels of truth, those subtle observations that we're noticing now, and think about, if continued and repeated, what would it look like over a period of time? Who will we become? If we don't like that answer, then we can work backwards and think, hey, I know that it's important for me to go through this brainstorming process. Therefore, AI to generate or to be my first line of defense for all homework is a clear boundary that I'd like to put in place with my students, for example.
So important for sure. And I think, again, bringing a degree of empathy to the conversation for all stakeholders, for the students using it, for the teachers who are bewildered by how to actually apply it within the classroom and how to manage student use, for the administrators who are trying to figure out how to set policy and direction around it, whether to lean into it or scale it back. I think it's great to sort of circle to the policy piece, right? We are all navigating the rapid influx of this technology in our learning space without a roadmap for what it should look like. The companies themselves who have released it to us are using us as the guinea pigs, right? To reveal what modifications need to be made based on how people are going to use it. So this puts a huge burden on schools because we don't have centralized policy from the top down directing us on its applications. Parents who are wondering what exactly the formal regulation is for schools, I mean, I don't have the best of news. It's highly unregulated. Within Canada specifically, we have no formal legislation at any level of government. Ontario as a province has produced a very broad framework in 2023, which as far as I can tell is a website, a page on a website that has 3 priorities and names the people in their working group. So not a lot of specifics for schools to drill down into. The Canadian Teachers Federation report on AI legislation and policy states that while AI poses substantial benefits, its unregulated integration into K-12 education poses risks to privacy, equity, and student well-being. We just last year already saw a PowerSchool data breach. PowerSchool is the main student information system that most schools across the province are using, and they've already had a significant data breach, which affected thousands of students across the province. And we are talking about minors and their sensitive information and the question of where that goes and how it's used or how it's exploited. At the federal level, we have the AIDA, which is the Artificial Intelligence Data Act, but this focuses primarily on business applications and has no specific provisions for K-12 education. So provincially, we have no comprehensive framework for schools, which places, like I said, a lot of onus on individual schools and boards and administrators to try to regulate how exactly this integration is going to look within their individual schools.
I mean, I do empathize with policymakers because I know it isn't easy to create policy when something is so foreign or misunderstood or there's not enough data. So I do respect that there is a process to policy development. And sometimes it is reactionary. And there needs to be an understanding of use before we can set things in place. And I think this time is very critical because we've now had a couple years of observation of how it is being used. And I think that conversations are starting to be had. In the meantime, while people are making decisions, I think it's important for parents to make the policy in their own home as well, which can come from a discernment of values and things that are important for you as a parent. So while maybe technological literacy might be a value, you might also value, for example, empathy or resilience or, name your skill, put that in. And you might want to think about discerning, what should be my policy as a parent based on what I think is important. And I think to think about that on your own before talking to too many people is important for you as parents because you are the guide for your children. You are number one. What you hold to be true without the noise of the world, without the ideas of competition. Is my child going to be left behind? Think about what you really want for your children. I'm sure health and happiness are a part of that. Always think about, how is AI being used? And then think about how might it affect my values? How might it affect my child's health and happiness? How might it affect their self-confidence? How might it affect, their ability to be resilient if I never have opportunities for failure or mistakes, or I'm chasing after perfection? So I think, sit down and have that idea. And then, of course, speak to other people. Talk with other people about how they see it, and then, co-create this understanding of what you think responsible use might look like, because your values and your input might influence someone in a positive way or bring to light things that they haven't thought of. The whole point is, we're not going to solve how to use AI typing in ChatGPT what's the best way to use AI. We're going to figure it out together as a community through authentic conversations, by tapping into what we believe in, what we value, what's important, and then discussing it in community.
I think that's such an important framework to give to parents, to have to think about their own autonomy, right, as a driver for direction for their child, especially because it's so unregulated in other spaces. I think we want to also emphasize that understandably, there's a lot of adults excited about its applications. People are using it for all kinds of things, whether it be a personal assistant, tax advice, retirement portfolio planning, therapy, which is a whole separate issue we'll touch on when we get into the companion AI piece. But I think what we have to remember is that while as adults who grew up and were educated without it, it's okay for us to explore its uses and be excited about its applications. We need to be a little bit more discerning when it comes to children and developing brains and the vulnerabilities that come with that blind faith in tech, and modeling for them both the benefits and the harms, having conversation about that piece, right? Kids are smart and they're so resourceful. And what I would caution parents is to consider that this kind of having a firm boundary or law of you can't use it, and that being executed in schools as well, doesn't teach them anything about it, right? So that means they're going to take that learning into their own hands. It doesn't mean that they're not going to use it and they're not going to explore it. They're just going to do so without telling you and without open conversation about how they're using it. So it really is a simple starting point at home for parents. I know we've circled a lot philosophically around its use in schools, the limitations, some benefits. What I would say for you at home, start by asking them what they know about it, how they're using it, where it's popping up for them. Don't be afraid to engage with your child's school as well, with their classroom teacher, to understand what their value system is around it, how it's being applied within the classroom or not. And to probe about policy too, right? I think as these things develop, community stakeholder input is so important, right? Parents should have a voice in how this is rolled out or delivered to their children, because there are risks and there are unknowns. There are benefits too. So I would say we don't want to run before we can walk when it comes to AI in a learning space, but you definitely want to have your voice and your input in that conversation, because it is your child and it is their learning journey.
Well said, Christy.
As we wrap up today, I want to point parents and educators to a helpful resource when discerning the place of AI in your child or student's learning. Common Sense Media released a position paper in 2023 that we'll link in the show notes, and it's titled AI and Our Kids: Common Sense Considerations and Guidance for Parents, Educators, and Policymakers. This document outlines 6 broad categories that they cite as potential opportunities for AI in education. These include 1, the potential for personalized learning. So this means things like tailoring lesson plans for pace, modality, path, and learning preferences to ensure that students are receiving a tailored or targeted, just right form of instruction. The potential to increase access, so expanding technological access and resources for kids to give them more additional tutoring, potentially quicker access to information, just sort of leveling the playing field when it comes to learning. The potential to increase creativity, potential to increase engagement and motivation using real-world scenarios or gamification. Fifth, the potential to center critical thinking skills using real-time feedback, supporting peer-to-peer learning and collaboration. And number 6, the potential to support teachers in managing their workload with an emphasis on augmenting rather than automating. So this is emphasizing that they should use it to make their lesson planning more efficient, more creative, and use it as a tool rather than completely outsourcing their lesson planning or generating to AI. So for me, the important distinction here between all 6 of these categories is the reliance on teacher input, the scaffolding and the facilitation that's necessary to actually introduce AI in these spaces and places within the classroom. None of these categories promote the unrestricted use of AI in the classroom, and none of them advocate for putting all questions into ChatGPT as a default strategy for learning.
Thank you for making those distinctions. I also just wanted to bring up another resource found within the same paper. On the last page of their report, they also have a chart with questions for parents and educators to go through that process of discernment. And they think about it in terms of different categories, like, is it safe? Is it a safe tool for kids? Has it been tuned or trained to keep users safe? Was the tool developed with kids in mind? Was it trained for diverse learners and perspectives? Or things like privacy, security, and transparency. How does the tool protect student privacy? How is the student data collected and stored? Is the data ever sold? So the list is much more comprehensive than I've shared today, but I just wanted to give you a window into the resource here because I think it is a great tool. Start thinking critically about your child's use of AI, and I strongly encourage you to have a look. So, although we are concluding today's dialogue, the conversation is not over just yet. This is episode 1 of a 3-part series on AI and education. Our next episode, we will be diving a little bit more into the workings of companion AI. We will share with you research on how it works, its consequences, and create space to think about the guardrails you might want to put in place with your children. Following that, on our final episode of this series, we have our first guest on the pod, a U of T and Stanford trained neurologist, Dr. Robert DeSantis, to talk to us about the developing brain in AI. He will break down digestible details, focus on how children are socialized and how they learn, and what we might want to consider when introducing AI to a developing brain.
Thank you for joining us to bridge the conversation between school and home, and we'll see you at the next parent-teacher conference.